Welcome to Old State Valuable Coins. In today's exciting video, we're exploring the top 4 most valuable and expensive United States wheat penny old coins. These historic little cents may look ordinary, but some rare dates, mint marks, varieties, and exceptional condition examples can be worth far more than their original 1-cent face value. Stay with us as we uncover their history, rarity, value, and the fascinating reasons collectors are willing to pay extraordinary prices for the right wheat penny. Let's get started. First up in the picture, a tiny copper cent leaving the Denver Mint in 1951, at a moment when the United States was standing at the intersection of post-war prosperity, Cold War tension, and a new military crisis in Korea. This was not a quiet year in American history. Harry S. Truman occupied the White House. The Korean War was demanding enormous national resources, and Americans were trying to maintain a prosperous civilian economy while factories, workers, and government agencies once again adapted to the demands of national defense. The 1951 D. Lincoln wheat cent entered that environment as ordinary money, yet today it provides a fascinating window into the America of the early 1950s. The Denver Mint struck 625,355,000 examples of the 1951 D, making it a heavily produced issue rather than a scarce date in the traditional sense. That enormous mintage is important because it immediately changes the way we should understand this coin. The story is not that only a handful were made. The story is what happened to those hundreds of millions afterward. In 1951, the Korean War had already transformed American priorities. The conflict had begun in June 1950 when North Korean forces invaded South Korea, and by 1951, the United States was deeply involved in the fighting as part of the United Nations effort. The war also transformed the economy. Factories were receiving new defense orders, employment was expanding, and government spending was increasing dramatically. Truman's economic reports described a rapidly growing economy accompanied by serious inflationary pressure, while national security spending was taking an increasingly important place in the nation's budget. By the end of 1951, civilian employment had reached roughly 61 million, while unemployment had fallen to approximately 1.7 million. That meant millions of Americans were working, earning wages, buying goods, and participating in an economy that was operating at extraordinary levels. Yet the prosperity had complications. Prices were rising, materials were being redirected toward defense production, and government officials were trying to prevent the Korean buildup from triggering another severe inflationary spiral. In January 1951, the administration introduced broad wage and price controls as part of that effort. So when the 1951 D cent entered someone's pocket, it entered an America that was confident in its industrial strength, but worried about inflation, communism, military escalation, and the possibility that the Korean conflict could become something much larger. This is what makes an ordinary Lincoln cent so fascinating. It was not created to commemorate a president, a battle, or a historic event. It was created because Americans needed small denomination money for everyday transactions, but that ordinary purpose placed the coin directly inside the machinery of American society. A cent could move from a factory worker's paycheck to a grocery store, from a merchant's cash drawer to a bank, from a child's pocket to a savings jar, and eventually into a collection where someone decades later would wonder whether it might be worth something more than 1 cent. The 1951 D also belonged to a coin design that had already become deeply embedded in American culture. The Lincoln cent had first appeared in 1909 to commemorate the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, and its designer was Victor David Brenner. By 1951, Americans had lived with the Lincoln portrait and wheat reverse for more than 40 years. The coin showed Lincoln facing right on the obverse, with liberty beside his portrait, in God we trust above, and the date with the Denver Mint mark beneath. The reverse displayed 2 wheat ears surrounding 1 cent and United States of America, while EPLUBUSUNUM appeared above. This design had already witnessed an extraordinary sequence of American history. The same basic wheat cent had circulated through the First World War, the prosperity of the 1920s, the Great Depression, World War II, the post-war boom, and now the Korean War era. The 1951D therefore was not merely another coin from a large production run. It was one more chapter in a design that had become familiar to grandparents, parents, workers, soldiers, merchants, and children. So when this 1951D wheat penny appears on your screen, remember that its greatest story is not contained entirely in its price. The tiny copper cent was born in a year when America was trying to manage two realities at once: the promise of economic prosperity and the pressure of a dangerous international confrontation. Truman was dealing with the Korean War, inflation, defense production, political opposition, and the difficult question of how much power the federal government should exercise over the economy. American workers were employed in enormous numbers, factories were operating at extraordinary levels, and the country was becoming increasingly central to the post-war world. At the same time, families were confronting rising prices, military uncertainty, and a rapidly changing political landscape. The 1951D cent was produced because everyday commerce required millions upon millions of small coins, and Denver supplied a substantial portion of that demand. More than 625 million were struck, meaning the ordinary issue is not a rare date. But time changed the population. Circulation destroyed detail. Natural exposure changed color. Mishandling created scratches. Cleaning damaged surfaces. Storage conditions affected copper. As a result, the surviving population became divided into ordinary examples and increasingly scarce high-quality survivors. A circulated 1951D may be worth only a modest amount. A nice uncirculated example can bring more. A high-grade red specimen can become substantially more valuable. And the finest certified examples can reach into the thousands, with a documented MS-68 RD 1951D selling for $8,100 in 2025. The existence of recognized varieties, such as the 1951D S over mintmark and repunched mintmarks, creates another path to rarity, because these coins are scarce, not because of their grade alone, but because of something unusual that happened during production. Yet the most important lesson is to avoid exaggeration. Not every 1951D is a hidden fortune, and there is no reliable basis for claiming that every example is worth hundreds, thousands, or millions. The real excitement comes from identifying what makes one particular coin different from the millions around it. If your coin is worn, it can still be a wonderful historical artifact. If it is unusually sharp, preserve it. If it has beautiful natural red color, examine it carefully. If the mintmark appears unusual, compare it with documented varieties. And if you think you may have an exceptional specimen, professional authentication and grading can be worthwhile before making any claims about value. More than 7 decades after its creation, the 1951D still carries the physical evidence of the world that produced it. Its wheat ears belong to an older America, its Lincoln portrait connects generations, and its tiny D places it inside the enormous production system of the Denver Mint. It passed through the hands of ordinary Americans while the Korean War dominated headlines and the Cold War was reshaping national priorities. Most examples became ordinary worn cents. A much smaller group survived beautifully. An even smaller group preserved remarkable varieties. And somewhere among those survivors is the reason collectors continue to examine these old pennies today. The 1951D is a reminder that rarity is not always created at the moment a coin is struck. Sometimes rarity is created slowly, 1 decade at a time, as millions of coins disappear into circulation and only a select few escape the damage of history. Next up to in the Imagine, holding a 1-cent coin struck more than 7 decades ago. A tiny piece of copper that passed through the hands of ordinary Americans during one of the most tense and transformative periods of the 20th century. This is the 1952D Lincoln wheat penny, carrying the small Denver D mintmark beneath the date, and while more than 700 million were produced, the story of this coin is far more interesting than its enormous production figure suggests. In 1952, America was living in a world that looked very different from the one we know today. The United States had emerged from the devastation of the Second World War as one of the strongest industrial powers on Earth, but the country was not living in complete peace. The Korean War was still raging overseas, the Cold War was reshaping American politics and foreign policy, and Americans were watching closely as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union continued to grow. President Harry S. Truman was still in the White House, but his presidency was approaching its final year, and the nation was preparing for another major presidential election. The economy was experiencing the complicated effects of post-war prosperity, military spending, inflation, and changing consumer demand. Factories were producing automobiles, appliances, machinery, and countless other products, while millions of Americans were building new lives in rapidly expanding suburbs. Yet beneath that prosperity was a sense of uncertainty. The Korean conflict had already caused enormous human suffering, and the possibility of a larger confrontation between global powers remained a frightening reality. Against this backdrop, a humble 1-cent coin continued doing exactly what it had been designed to do: move through everyday American life. The 1952 D-wheat penny could have been used to buy part of a newspaper, contribute toward a small purchase, make change at a neighborhood store, or sit unnoticed inside a cash register. Its value was only 1 cent, but its usefulness was enormous because the American economy still relied heavily on physical coins for everyday transactions. This is what makes the coin fascinating. It was not originally created to become a collector's treasure. It was created to serve ordinary people in an extraordinary period of American history. To understand why the 1952 D-penny exists in the first place, we have to travel back to the creation of the Lincoln cent design. The Lincoln cent had entered American commerce in 1909, marking the first regular United States circulating coin to feature the portrait of an actual historical American president. The designer was Victor David Brenner, whose portrait of Abraham Lincoln appeared on the obverse, while 2 wheat ears surrounded the denomination and inscription on the reverse. The design became one of the most recognizable pieces of American coinage. By 1952, the wheat reverse Lincoln cent had already been circulating for more than 40 years, meaning that an American born in the late 19th century could have grown up with this same familiar coin in their pocket. The 1952 D was struck at the Denver Mint, and the D beneath the date identified its place of manufacture. Its specifications were simple but important. The coin measured about 19 millimeters across, weighed approximately 3.11 grams, and was made from a bronze alloy consisting primarily of copper with smaller amounts of tin and zinc. That composition gave the coin its warm reddish appearance when new, although decades of exposure to air, moisture, handling, chemicals, and circulation could gradually transform the surface into red-brown or brown. The Denver Mint produced an enormous quantity of these cents in 1952, with an official mintage of 746,130,000 pieces. That number immediately tells us something important about rarity. The ordinary 1952 D Lincoln cent is not a scarce coin simply because it is old. Hundreds of millions were produced, and many millions survived. So when collectors describe a 1952 D as valuable, they are usually talking about something beyond the basic date and mint mark. The real story begins when we examine condition, color, strike quality, die varieties, errors, and survival. A worn brown example found in an old jar is historically interesting, but it is not automatically worth a fortune. On the other hand, a sharply struck, original red example with exceptional surfaces can become dramatically more desirable. That difference between an ordinary survivor and an exceptional survivor is one of the most important lessons in coin collecting. And the timing of this coin's production gives it an extraordinary historical setting. In 1952, the United States was still spending heavily because of the Korean War, which had begun in 1950 after North Korean forces crossed into South Korea. American soldiers remained deployed thousands of miles from home, while families followed the conflict through newspapers, radio reports, and newsreels. The war also influenced the American economy because military production and government spending created enormous demand for industrial materials and manufactured goods. At the same time, Americans were experiencing the continuing transition from wartime restrictions toward a consumer-oriented economy. During the Second World War, the government had imposed various controls and rationing measures, and after the war ended, consumers increasingly wanted automobiles, refrigerators, televisions, homes, clothing, and other goods that had been difficult to obtain during wartime. By 1952, the United States was becoming a society increasingly associated with mass production and mass consumption, but there were serious economic tensions. Prices had risen substantially during and after the war, labor disputes remained significant, and the Korean conflict created new pressures on industry. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred when President Truman attempted to prevent a nationwide steel strike by ordering the federal government to seize and operate the nation's steel mills. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled against the administration in the famous Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company case. The dispute revealed just how complicated the relationship between government, workers, and industry had become. At the same time, political life was becoming increasingly tense because of fears surrounding communism. Senator Joseph McCarthy's accusations and investigations had contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion in American public life, while the Cold War influenced everything from foreign policy to education and popular culture. In November 1952, voters would elect Dwight D. Eisenhower as president, bringing the Republican Party back to the White House after 2 decades of Democratic presidents. Eisenhower's victory represented a major political transition and reflected the public's desire for a different direction after years dominated by the New Deal, the Second World War, and the Korean conflict. Through all of this, the 1952 D-penny continued circulating quietly. It did not announce the political battles of the era. It simply moved from person to person, becoming an unnoticed witness to a country experiencing tremendous change. And finally, there's something deeply fascinating about the 1952 D-wheat penny that goes beyond any price guide or auction record. This coin was born at a moment when America was standing between two worlds. The old memories of the Great Depression and the Second World War were still close, yet the nation was moving rapidly toward the prosperous consumer culture of the 1950s. Harry Truman was nearing the end of his presidency. Dwight Eisenhower was about to begin a new political chapter. American soldiers were still fighting in Korea. The Cold War was intensifying. Television was entering more American homes, suburbs were expanding, factories were running at enormous capacity, and families were imagining a future built around economic opportunity and modern technology. Somewhere inside that enormous national transformation, a 1952 D. Lincoln cent could pass unnoticed from a worker's paycheck to a grocery store, from a cash register into a child's pocket, and eventually into a jar or drawer where it might remain for decades. Today, that tiny piece of copper can serve as a physical connection to an America that no longer exists. And although 746,130,000 were struck at Denver, the truly exceptional survivors have become much harder to find. PCGS records the finest known examples in the MS-67 plus red category, while the auction record of $3,840 demonstrates the premium collectors can place on an extraordinary specimen. So if you have a 1952 D wheat penny, don't immediately assume that the date alone makes it a fortune. Instead, look closer. Check the mint mark, study the color, examine the fields, look for unusual die characteristics, consider whether the coin has been cleaned or naturally preserved. Most importantly, remember that rarity is not simply about how old a coin is or how many were originally made. True rarity can come from survival, condition, originality, variety, and demand. The ordinary 1952 D penny tells the story of hundreds of millions of coins made for everyday Americans, but the finest survivors tell another story, the story of how a common object can become uncommon through 7 decades of survival. That is what makes the 1952 D Lincoln wheat penny worth examining, worth researching, and worth preserving. Not because every example is a hidden fortune, but because every genuine example carries a small piece of the America that produced it. Next up when you look at a 1953 D Lincoln wheat penny, It is easy to see nothing more than a small, old 1-cent coin, but this particular piece of American money was born during a fascinating turning point in United States history. The tiny D beneath the date tells us that this cent was produced at the Denver Mint, while the Lincoln portrait connects it to one of the longest-running and most recognizable designs in American coinage. In 1953, America was entering a new chapter. The Second World War had ended only 8 years earlier, but its consequences still influenced politics, industry, technology, and everyday life. The Korean War was still underway, creating enormous military and economic pressures, while the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was becoming an increasingly dominant feature of international affairs. Dwight D. Eisenhower had just taken office as president in January 1953, succeeding Harry S. Truman after a presidential campaign in which Americans debated communism, national security, military spending, government policy, and the direction of the country. Eisenhower was not simply another politician taking office. He was a highly recognizable military leader who had served as supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during the Second World War. His arrival at the White House represented a psychological shift for many Americans, from the extraordinary years of Roosevelt and Truman toward a new administration promising stability and a different approach to government. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans were experiencing a rapidly changing economy. Suburban communities were expanding, automobiles were becoming increasingly central to family life, household appliances were spreading through American homes, and television was beginning to transform entertainment and news. Yet prosperity existed alongside anxiety. The Korean conflict remained dangerous, inflation and labor disputes affected economic life, and fears of communist influence created intense political tension. Through all these changes, the 1-cent coin remained one of the most familiar pieces of money in daily American life. The 1953 D-cent was not created as a future collectible or investment. It was manufactured because businesses, workers, families, and consumers needed coins for everyday transactions. Its original purpose was wonderfully ordinary: to make change, settle small debts, and keep the nation's cash economy moving. The story of the 1953 D-penny becomes even more interesting when we consider why the Lincoln cent had such an important place in American society. The Lincoln design had first appeared in 1909, created by sculptor Victor David Brenner, and it represented a major change in United States coinage because Abraham Lincoln became the first actual American president to appear on a regular circulating United States coin. Brenner's portrait placed Lincoln facing right on the obverse, while the original reverse showed 2 wheat ears surrounding the denomination and inscriptions. By 1953, Americans had been using this wheat reverse Lincoln cent for more than 4 decades. Children had grown up finding them in pockets, adults had carried them to stores and workplaces, and merchants had handled countless examples at cash registers. The 1953 D continued that tradition with a composition primarily consisting of copper, along with smaller amounts of tin and zinc, giving newly struck examples their distinctive reddish copper appearance. The coin measured approximately 19 millimeters in diameter and weighed around 3.11 grams. Its Denver D mint mark identified the facility where it was struck. In 1953, Denver produced approximately 700,515,000 Lincoln cents with the D mint mark, making this a very large production issue. That number is crucial because it immediately challenges one of the most common misconceptions about old coins: age alone does not create rarity. A coin can be more than 70 years old and still be common if enormous quantities were produced and large numbers survived. The 1953 D falls into that category in ordinary circulated grades, but the situation changes when we begin looking at exceptional condition, original red color, high-grade surfaces, strong strikes, and recognized varieties. A circulated brown penny that spent decades in commerce is fundamentally different from a pristine red example that somehow escaped heavy handling. This is where the real collecting story begins, because every year that passes removes some coins from the surviving population through loss, corrosion, damage, cleaning, destruction, or simple neglect. The coins that remain in extraordinary condition become increasingly interesting precisely because they represent a tiny fraction of the original production. When we reach the subject of value, the 1953D becomes a perfect example of why online claims about rare pennies worth thousands should be treated carefully. The majority of 1953D wheat cents are not worth enormous sums. In circulated brown condition, values are generally modest, often ranging from only a few cents to a small number of dollars depending on preservation and collector demand. Uncirculated examples can move into higher territory, especially when they retain attractive original color. At the top end, the difference becomes enormous. PCGS records a 1953D Lincoln cent graded MS67 red as having reached $2,760 at auction in 2018, while the PCGS price guide has listed high-grade red examples in the upper hundreds to low thousands depending on grade and market conditions. PCGS population information also shows that the very finest certified examples are exceptionally scarce, compared with the millions of surviving low-grade pieces. These figures should not be interpreted as saying every bright-looking 1953D penny is worth thousands. In fact, a coin with artificial shine, polishing, harsh cleaning, or damage can be worth far less than a naturally preserved example of similar apparent brightness. The highest prices belong to coins with exceptional technical quality and originality. If you are examining a 1953D yourself, start with the basics. Confirm that the date is genuinely 1953 and that the mint mark is the Denver D. Then look at Lincoln's portrait, especially the hair and facial details, because heavy wear will quickly reveal itself. Examine the fields for scratches and contact marks. Turn the coin over and inspect the wheat ears and lettering for sharpness. Then study the color under neutral lighting. A naturally red copper surface can be extremely attractive, while a suspiciously bright orange or mirror-like appearance may indicate cleaning or chemical treatment. If you believe you have discovered an unusual variety, compare the specific characteristics with reliable numismatic references rather than assuming every irregularity is a mint error. And that brings us to the reason the 1953D Lincoln wheat penny remains such a fascinating coin for collectors today. It is not simply a piece of copper stamped with the image of Abraham Lincoln. It is a survivor from an America that was rapidly changing. When this penny entered circulation, Eisenhower had just become president. The Korean War was still unfolding. The Cold War was creating international tension. Television was beginning to reshape American culture. Suburbs were spreading beyond city centers, and the nation's factories were helping build an increasingly consumer-driven economy. A 1-cent coin could pass through all of those environments without anyone realizing that decades later collectors would examine its color, strike, surfaces, and microscopic die characteristics. The 1953D is therefore a lesson in the difference between mintage and rarity. About 700 million were produced, but only a fraction survived in truly remarkable condition. Millions of circulated examples remain historically interesting but financially modest, while top-grade red specimens can command hundreds or even thousands of dollars when collectors compete for them. The finest known pieces represent the extreme end of the survival story, where decades of careful preservation have protected a coin from the scratches, oxidation, circulation, and mishandling that affected so many others. If you have one of these pennies, don't judge it only by its age or by dramatic claims about enormous values. Look carefully at what you actually have. A worn brown 1953D may be a charming historical keepsake. A sharply struck, naturally red, high-grade example could be much more desirable, and a genuine recognized variety could add another layer of interest. The greatest appeal of this coin is that it allows us to hold a small physical object connected to a huge historical moment. More than 70 years later, that tiny Denver minted cent still carries the evidence of its journey through American commerce and history. Its face shows Lincoln, its reverse preserves the wheat design of an earlier generation, and its surfaces record the passage of time. Most importantly, the 1953D reminds us that extraordinary value does not always begin with a rare date. Sometimes it begins with an ordinary coin that survived extraordinarily well. Next up in the imagine holding a 1-cent coin that was struck at the very end of one of the most famous chapters in American coinage. At first glance, the 1958 D. Lincoln wheat penny may look like an ordinary old copper cent, and in one important sense, it is exactly that. It was made in enormous numbers for everyday commerce. But this particular date carries a remarkable historical distinction. The 1958 D was among the final regular Lincoln cents to carry Victor David Brenner's famous wheatear reverse, because the following year the United States Mint introduced the Lincoln Memorial Reverse and brought the wheat cent era to an end. The Denver Mint produced an astonishing 800,953,300 examples of the 1958 D, making it absolutely essential to understand that this is not a rare coin simply because it is old. Its real appeal comes from the combination of age, historical importance, condition rarity, and the possibility of finding an exceptionally preserved example. The coin was struck from bronze containing approximately 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc, weighed 3.11 grams, measured 19 millimeters across, and carried the familiar plain edge of the Lincoln cent. The small letter D beneath the date identifies Denver as the minting facility. But to understand why this little coin deserves attention, we have to travel back to America in 1958, a country standing between two very different worlds. The United States was only 13 years removed from the end of the Second World War, yet the enormous wartime transformation of American industry was already becoming part of history. The country had entered the Cold War. American families were buying automobiles and household appliances at a rapidly changing pace. Television was becoming a dominant part of everyday life, and the competition with the Soviet Union had pushed science, education, defense, and technology into the national spotlight. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was in the White House, and the Eisenhower administration was navigating an America experiencing both confidence and uncertainty. The country was wealthy by international standards, but economic growth was not moving in a perfectly straight line. A recession had begun in 1957 and continued into 1958, bringing rising unemployment and a slowdown in industrial production. At the same time, Americans were watching an extraordinary technological contest unfold above them. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 had shocked the American public and intensified the space race, creating a sense that scientific achievement had become part of national security. In the same period, the United States was confronting enormous social questions involving racial segregation and civil rights. The struggles surrounding the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957 had demonstrated that the federal government could no longer remain detached from the confrontation between segregation and constitutional rights. So when this 1958 D penny was being produced, America was not simply living through an ordinary year. It was a nation experiencing economic anxiety, technological excitement, political tension, and profound social change all at once. The story of the 1958 D cent becomes even more fascinating when we look at why the Lincoln penny existed in the first place. The Lincoln cent had been introduced in 1909 during the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, becoming the first regular United States coin to place the portrait of an actual American president on the circulating coinage of the nation. Victor David Brenner, an accomplished sculptor and engraver, created the portrait of Lincoln that Americans would continue seeing for generations. On the reverse, Brenner placed two wheat ears surrounding the words 1 cent and United States of America, along with the Latin motto E Pluribus Unum. The wheat design was more than decoration. Wheat was one of the great agricultural symbols of American productivity, and the reverse gave the humble 1 cent coin a distinctly national character. For nearly half a century, that design traveled through every level of American life. A Lincoln cent could be dropped into a child's pocket, placed into a shopkeeper's cash drawer, used alongside a newspaper vending machine, carried by factory workers, saved in household jars, or passed between generations. Its purchasing power was small, but its reach was enormous. By 1958, The Lincoln cent had already survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the economic mobilization of the 1940s, post-war prosperity, and the beginning of the Cold War. The Denver Mint was therefore not producing the 1958 D because someone knew it would become a collectible treasure decades later. The Mint was fulfilling an ordinary economic need. The United States required huge quantities of small denomination coins to keep commerce functioning. The cent was particularly important because low-value transactions still depended heavily upon physical coins. Prices, taxes, vending machines, newspapers, public transportation, stores, and countless everyday purchases depended on these tiny denominations. The Denver Mint consequently struck hundreds of millions of 1958 D cents. The enormous mintage tells us something important about the economy of the period. The cent was still an essential working piece of money, yet history has a strange way of turning ordinary objects into artifacts. When the last 1958 Lincoln wheat cents left the production line, nobody using one in a grocery store or dropping one into a pocket could know that they were handling the final regular Denver issue of the famous wheat reverse. The following year, the reverse would change to Frank Gasparo's Lincoln Memorial design, marking the end of Brenner's wheatier design on regular issue Lincoln cents. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside the 1958 D wheat penny. This is not a story about a coin where every example is secretly worth a fortune. It is a story about how ordinary money can become extraordinary through history, preservation, and scarcity at the highest levels of condition. More than 800 million 1958 D cents were struck, so the date itself is plentiful, and anyone claiming that a normal circulated example is automatically worth hundreds or thousands of dollars is ignoring the most important facts. But somewhere among those hundreds of millions were coins that escaped circulation almost completely. Some may have remained in rolls. Some may have been placed into collections when they were brand new. Some may have sat untouched for decades in old bank holdings or family collections. And those survivors can tell a completely different story. The current documented market demonstrates that ordinary examples and elite condition examples occupy completely different price levels, with the finest certified red pieces reaching into the thousands, while normal circulated coins remain inexpensive. There is no reliable exact count of every 1958 D still alive today, but the surviving population is clearly large, while the number of coins reaching the very highest grades is much smaller. That is the real rarity equation. Mintage tells us how many were born. Survival tells us how many remain. Condition tells us how many are truly desirable. And collector competition determines what the best examples can ultimately bring. So if you discover a 1958 D wheat penny in an old collection, do not throw it aside simply because the date is common, but do not assume it is a jackpot either. Examine the surfaces, check for original color, look for signs of cleaning or damage, study the strike, and compare it with professionally graded examples. If it appears unusually sharp and beautifully preserved, professional authentication and grading may be worth considering. The 1958 D is historically powerful precisely because it sits at the boundary between two eras. It is one of the last regular Denver Lincoln wheat cents, one of the final survivors of Victor David Brenner's original reverse, and a tiny copper witness to an America entering the modern age. When you hold one in your hand, you are not just holding 1 cent. You are holding a piece of the closing chapter of a coin design that had served Americans since 1909, a coin that passed through the hands of generations before disappearing from the nation's pocket change. And if your particular 1958 D happens to be an exceptionally preserved red specimen, that ordinary piece of history can suddenly become something much more difficult to find, and potentially worth far more than the single cent stamped into its face.